All right, I do see some folks coming in still and trickling into our space today, so they can join us as we get started. And so welcome and thank you for joining us today on our session around teaching dossiers. And I'm incredibly excited to be here this morning to talk to you about preparing a teaching dossier, and hopefully to help answer some questions that you might have if you are revising a dossier or starting a dossier for the first time. My name is Carolyn McCrae. I work in the Center for Teaching and Learning as an educational developer, and most of my work is focused on helping graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and early career educators in their professional development as educators. I do want to mention that today's session is going to be recorded. We are intending to share the session today on our YouTube channel for those who couldn't make it this morning into our virtual space, and for those who have asked for a copy of the recording just for their own ability to kind of follow along at their own pace after the session today. So I do want to start with a land acknowledgement, and I know that we're joining in a virtual space and that all of you may be joining from different areas and different territories. So this is a moment not only to reflect on the land acknowledgement that I'll do for where I am situated today, but to take a moment to reflect on where you might be situated that is different than Queen's. I am joining you from physically on the main campus of Queen's University in Kingston or Cataraqui, the land and home of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, and the historical territory that they have cared for since time immemorial, and that many Indigenous people call home still today. Part of what I wanted to do by thinking about our land acknowledgement today was think specifically about the fact that many of us at the university hold a number of different hats at the same time, that of student, that of educator, maybe researcher. It might be a place that you have grown up, or it might be a place that you are currently living that is not home. But thinking about specifically one of those hats that we wear, and that's our role as an educator. And focusing today on what does the work of decolonization and reconciliation mean in our work specifically as educators. And I think that there are multiple ways that we should be thinking about this. It's the work that we do in the classroom, but it's also the way that we look at our courses and design our courses outside the classroom, in terms of ways of knowing, bringing Indigenous voices into the scholarship of what we are looking at in our courses, but also the ways that we construct and design things like our assessments. How does that integrate with what we're going to talk about today with our teaching dossier? I think it's important, as we talk about our teaching dossiers, to also reflect on all of the teaching choices that we make. And I think we'll circle back to how this is a really good opportunity for you to do that kind of reflective work in a few slides. All right, so what are the goals for our time together today? So this session will have about a 45-minute presentation piece at the start where we're going to go through a few of the pieces of what is a teaching dossier and how it might be used in different contexts. We'll go through the general structure of a teaching dossier, as well as starting to think about how you can articulate your own teaching philosophy statement, and align your kind of values and what you believe to what you do in the classroom. And then finally, we'll talk about presenting some evidence of teaching effectiveness. After the 45-minute presentation, the goal is to open this up into a Q&A where you can ask questions, we can have a discussion about some of the pieces of the dossier, and that portion we will not record. We will make sure we stop the recording so that we can kind of have an open discussion with everyone in the room. At any point, you can put questions in the chat. I have the chat open, and I also have my colleague Yasmin here who will help point me in the direction of questions if I don't notice them as they come in. So please feel free, if there is something on your mind as we are going through any of the topics today, to please throw something in the chat, and we will make sure that we get to it as soon as we can. All right. So today's session is about teaching dossiers. And I guess the first question that would be important to ask ourselves is, what is a teaching dossier? And I've pulled this quote because I think it does a great job at kind of giving a quick summary of what a teaching dossier is intended to do. And that is that they are intended to provide a summary of a professor's major teaching accomplishments and strengths in the form of a selected short narrative descriptions of activities and achievement that convey the scope and quality of the individual's teaching through multiple sources of evidence. So what does this mean? So really this document, a teaching dossier in whole, we're going to look at around 8 to 12 pages, but it's a curated document. It's going to be incredibly important for you to think intentionally about what you are putting in this document to focus on you as an educator. It's going to be reflective not just of a listed record of your teaching, but it provides a real story of who you are as a teacher, the impact that you have had on students, the impact that you might have had more broadly in the educational space, both at the institutions that you've taught at, or also within your discipline. It's concise in the sense that it is not a full, extensive, some of us might be able to write 30 pages about this topic, but really it needs to be a concise document. And we'll talk about that as we talk about who your reader of this document might be. And then really we want to focus on multiple sources of evidence. So we will see that one of the sections that's really important in our dossier is how we evidence our teaching practices and how we determine that the impact that they're having. And so this document is going to be something where instead of just like a CV, where we have a list and we have a description, here we're actually going to dive into what some of this means. What does all of this teaching integrate to mean like holistically together? Okay. So what are you using the dossier for? So many of us, I think, will understand and have seen the term teaching dossier or teaching portfolio as it's used more commonly in the United States and across other places in the world. Many of us might have seen this term used more frequently in academic job applications. If it's your first time kind of venturing into the academic world, not surprisingly, many applications will ask you for a teaching dossier or different specific components of that teaching dossier. Once you are in the academic industry, it is a really important document for tenure, renewal, and promotion. So it's not a document that's a one-time thing. It is a dynamic and living document that in your academic role will be a part of your career from essentially the point of application as you continue teaching in academia. It's your way of articulating your contributions to the space of teaching and learning and your contributions to education within your discipline. You may also need a teaching dossier for award nomination packages. If you are nominating yourself or someone is nominating you for an award, oftentimes this is a great source of information around your impact of teaching. And they will ask for, again, a full dossier or components of it. And then finally, the last kind of why of the creating a dossier is one that I think is less talked about in the broad community, but is equally as important. And that's your opportunity to reflect on your teaching practices, the why of the choices that you make in the classroom, in the curriculum, and to start writing down what you do. Something that can be really tough if you're a grad student or a postdoc is going back and remembering those things that you may have done 3, 4, 5 years ago and being able to reflect on those opportunities. So my suggestion too is if you are anywhere within your graduate or postdoctoral or early career stage of your career right now, start thinking about writing things down. Even if it just starts as a Word document where you start to put in some subheadings and categories, start to write down everything that you do in the teaching landscape. The other thing that I mentioned here quickly was that this is a dynamic document. And what this means is some of the information that we talk about today is going to get you started on writing a dossier. However, you might kind of reiterate and come back to your dossier a year from now and notice that your teaching has changed or something about your values you can articulate in a better way. So this is a document that you are going to want to keep handy and to think about and reflect upon. I would say at least once a year coming back to it and making some changes. For those of you that might be joining us in the room today who are faculty at Queen's currently, something to know is that the teaching dossier is mentioned in a number of places in the CUFA collective agreement. So for those that aren't faculty in the room, this is the faculty agreement or the faculty union collective agreement. The reason I think it's important to mention this is that even if you're not faculty currently, but you are applying for tenure track and faculty positions at other institutions, many times teaching dossiers are mentioned within faculty unions and collective agreements as one method of evaluation of teaching and presenting the collective work that you have done in the teaching space. So here in our Queen's Faculty Association Collective Agreement, the teaching dossier is mentioned in Article 29 on evaluation and assessment of teaching, and that becomes a part of your package where you demonstrate your contributions to teaching. Specifically, it dives in more depth, and I'm not going to go through all of this because there's a lot of text, and I even cut out a bunch of it here, but I encourage you, if you are faculty or if you're interested in this, to go read it. But section 29.2.1 is all about the teaching dossier and what you can include within your teaching dossier. And I think that this is a really good thing to take a look at to get a sense of, how is the faculty union and how is the collective agreement describing what a teaching dossier is and what they expect for you to include in terms of going up for tenure, renewal, and promotion. Okay, so now diving into, I think, where many of you might be starting if you are starting a teaching dossier for the first time, and that is what goes into a teaching dossier. This list is, I would say, not extensive, but it's a snapshot of what you might see as the main headers within a teaching dossier. You will see them in different orders. You will see a bit of different language. It's really an individualized document that you want to create and craft that makes sense to you. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I would give you is read some sample dossiers and see what stands out as impactful to you, and start crafting your dossier kind of around that structure. So where will we start? So you'll have a title page, a table of contents that goes through kind of the headings and the subheadings that you choose. And then your dossier will start with a biographical statement. It's brief. It goes into not details about your whole life biography, but it's a biography of who you are as an educator. Usually about a half page, but it's the quick introduction to, if I was to ask you for maybe like the elevator pitch of, in a snapshot, in 2 minutes, what can you tell me about how you came to be an educator and what you teach? Those are what types of descriptions we think when we think about the biographical statement. The sections that we are going to focus on primarily in the session today are starting to think about your teaching philosophy statement, your teaching responsibilities, and then collecting evidence of your teaching effectiveness. It's not to say the other sections aren't important. They are very important, equally important. However, a lot of the other sections, so thinking about innovation, curriculum design, scholarship, awards, those might come as you develop more and more teaching experience. And it's okay for your first iteration of a teaching dossier to not have something in every single one of these sections. You might not have every section in your first dossier, but what you can do is you can continue to add things and make new sections and add to it as you develop more experience. One section that we can come back to at the end is professional development and learning. And I suggest that everyone includes this in their dossier and starts to build out and put in here anything that you do in terms of development of your own teaching. Attending this session today is like a first step, but any other workshops that you attend, conferences that you go to that have things around teaching within your discipline, all of that is really important to document and to put into your dossier as part of that professional development. Part of the presentation today, as well as more descriptions of each of these sessions, is available in a document on our website called The Elements of a Teaching Dossier. It's a PDF resource. It's quite short, and it's a snapshot, and it's a really good thing to kind of go back to look at if you want a brief description of all of these different sections. And I did see in the chat, Yasmin responded, we will circulate the slides from today's session so that you have all of these links as well. All right, so we're going to dive into the three sections more specifically that we're going to look at today, starting with your teaching philosophy statement. The reason we put so much emphasis on the teaching philosophy statement is because this is really the core that's going to be the foundation of your teaching dossier. All other components of your teaching dossier are going to somehow link back to your teaching philosophy statement, because everything that you write in your philosophy statement is going to be kind of that grounding value of who you are. And your other sections are going to be the evidence of how you put that into practice and how you are implementing those strategies, those decisions, that impact you want on students, how you are engaging with that in the classroom or in the curriculum. So your teaching philosophy statement is that first point that I suggest everyone would start with. And what is it? Well, really, a teaching philosophy statement is a systemic and critical rationale that focuses on the important components defining effective teaching and learning in a particular discipline and or institutional context. This comes from a paper that is written by Sean Wetter a while back now, but is a really good resource on diving into teaching philosophy statements specifically. And the reason I refer back to this Sean Wetter paper and this quote is around the emphasis on this being particular to your discipline and your institutional context. And really what that means is that this is a point of reflection on who you are, but it also needs to be who you are in relation to all of the ways that you are connected to your own teaching contributions. And that is going to be linked to your discipline. It is going to be linked to where you have had the opportunities to teach. And a lot of times our teaching will change depending on the context, whether that is we're teaching at institutions in different parts of the world, or we're teaching at institutions that have different values in how we teach. So maybe we're at an institution that focuses heavily on student engaged and inquiry-based learning. Or we're at an institution that focuses on kind of workplace integrated or very vocational teaching aspects. Your teaching philosophy statement needs to be grounded in all of those elements of your context. It's going to be a statement that is unique to you. It should not be something that you can kind of trade with someone else and it makes sense to someone else in your department or a colleague. It's going to be really unique to what you do in your teaching practices. So how do you start to write one? Because I feel like this, although we've kind of emphasized that this is a really important and critical point of your dossier, I also think this is probably one of the most overwhelming pieces to write as a first-time educator sitting down to write a philosophy statement. You know, how do you know what you're doing in the classroom and how do you know that impact? So I think we like to break it down into a few steps, and I've written those steps as questions. So the first is, what are your beliefs and values about teaching? So thinking about, what is the role of the learner? What is the role of a teacher in the classroom? What makes good teaching and learning in the class? So if I'm going to walk into your classroom, how do I know that great learning is happening? What does that look like, feel like, sound like? All of these elements of how do you choose to do things in the classroom? What are those grounded in? What are your values? As you think about your values, your beliefs, you need to then think about, okay, what strategies do you use to enact those in the classroom? And those are going to be linked. What you believe and how you choose to do things in the classroom should have a real clear alignment. Next is thinking about, how do you measure your impact? So chances are the strategies that you pick are because you think they are effective for student learning. But how do you measure that it's actually helping our students? And we'll get into evidence of teaching effectiveness, but as you think about your philosophy, something that might be important is thinking about not only why you are choosing to use the strategies and instructional approaches that you do, but why those seem to be creating a positive student learning environment. And then the last piece is, what are your future goals? So most of us who are educators or who have pursued kind of an academic career are here because we are also lifelong learners. And so it's also important to think about, what are your goals? How are you going to improve in your role as an educator? And part of that will come out in later sections of your dossier and your professional development, but it's also important to include some of those things within your teaching philosophy statement to showcase how you intend to grow in your role as an educator. So what makes a really strong teaching philosophy? So the first is really keep it concise. Most teaching philosophy statements are no more than 2 pages long. And really, this comes back to who's going to read it. So if we think about using a teaching dossier for renewal, tenure, promotion, or job applications or awards, your reader might be reading a lot of these. So you want to make sure that it is something that they don't lose focus while reading. 2 pages is really going to keep your reader's attention and be able to capture, hopefully, in that 2 pages, who you are and what you do. So if you're keeping it short to 2 pages, keep it specific. Don't stop at kind of sweeping statements about what you hope to do, or, really big, broad ambitions of, I want to be a learner-centered teacher. Great. Give me the specifics of what you're going to do and how you're going to make that happen. We really want to see examples. We want to see concrete activities that you've done in the classroom, how it links to your assessment. So the most effective teaching philosophy statements will really dive into, I did this in this course in this way to showcase and to really enact this value. Next is show evidence of reflection. So explaining the rationale for why you do what you do. This is where I think that individualization of your teaching philosophy comes out, is by your kind of explanations of those intricacies of why you have chosen the things that you do. Next is grounding it in your discipline. Think about what is specific to teaching within your discipline. So, for example, much of my teaching experience comes from the health sciences and human anatomy. We're a very visual discipline. So I make a lot of choices around visuals and hands-on and tactile learning that is a really key component of my teaching philosophy. That might be very different for someone in computing or engineering or in English. So thinking about what are the specific pedagogical approaches to teaching that are unique to your discipline and how are they important to you? Make it memorable. So it's short, it's 2 pages. It's going to be about you and your teaching, but it has to be something that someone is going to remember. So my biggest suggestion is have someone else read it. Have someone within your discipline read it, a friend, a colleague, but also someone outside your discipline. This is what we do at the Center for Teaching and Learning. We read a lot of these and provide feedback. And my suggestion is the more feedback that you get from different readers, the more they can point out the things that are really impactful and effective and the things that are leading them to have questions. And the more you refine and the more you clarify things in your teaching philosophy statement, I think the more impactful and memorable it can be. Oh, there we go. That was my next piece of advice. Get feedback. Get feedback from others, both within and outside of your own discipline. All right. So from your teaching philosophy statement, the next part is to link that to what do you actually do? What are the teaching activities and responsibilities that you have? And this is going to look like a bit of a list, but a nice expanded list of everything you have done, from things like guest lecture opportunities, invited speaking, teaching assistantships or teaching fellowships. If you have been a course instructor, whether that's a teaching fellow, an adjunct, faculty for undergraduate, graduate courses, student supervision and mentorship. I think this is especially important when we talk about clinical teaching, if we have any clinicians in the room. Here you might also talk about some of the work that you do in course development and teaching innovation. Are you involved in helping to build courses? So sometimes there are opportunities for us to create a brand new course. And that is even something that might be nice to explain in this section, as opposed to our responsibilities just TAing or teaching a course. But for those of us who have created new courses from scratch. And the last thing that you might include here is also the administrative or committee work that you do in relation to teaching and learning. So that might be a departmental or a faculty level committee around teaching and learning. It could be something that you do within your discipline. So many of our disciplines have conferences or groups that are involved in teaching and learning. And all of that kind of work outside of the classroom, outside of the institution, is also important to include within your teaching dossier. What these sections look like can vary tremendously. And this is where it's important to understand that there is no one template for a dossier. My suggestion is, again, to read some samples, see what speaks to you for the levels of experience that you have. And the way you outfit some of these sections is going to change the more experience that you gain. So I have a few examples, and I've picked a few examples that are really different to get you a sense of how some people lay out the information that they have. So this is an example from someone who has described their responsibilities as a TA for a course. They've included some of the logistics and the context, which I think is very important here. You want to give your reader a sense of what your responsibilities were. So here it's about a TA, and they've included the number of students, that it was in a laboratory, a course description, and some of the responsibilities. This is in bullet point form, that's fine. You might also have someone that takes a more narrative approach to the description. As you gain more and more experience, it might make more sense for you to start compacting some of this into a table that shows, did you teach the same course or were you involved in the same course over a number of years? This is an example that comes out of a sample teaching dossier on our website, where Dr. Brian Frank in engineering has taught the same courses over multiple years. But we also can see here that we've included the number of students, some demographics of, who's in the course. Is this an elective course or a mandatory course? And then after the table, there's been a narrative about what the course is about. And I think that that narrative piece is really important for your reader to contextualize what the experience was and how does this integrate into maybe if you like future experiences. If you are using this dossier for application to another institution, the context is important because they might not know course codes and what this means and what the type of course is. So this narrative really gives your reader a better sense of what your experience was and how it might link to what you're applying to do. Here's another example. This comes from another sample dossier on our website right now. This is someone who's been teaching the same course for, here the example is 10 years. They've been teaching Drama 100. So a much more descriptive paragraph here about what the course is, the role, and then a list of the years that it's been taught. My suggestion is make this section work for you. Start by listing out all of the experiences that you want to include in your teaching responsibilities section. Then include all of those pieces of context that you have information about. Then start to format it in a way that makes sense. I think the one thing that you'll want to do is write out everything. And then when you see what you have, you're going to have to fit it into about 8, 10, 12 pages is going to be a big one. Fitting it into what the context of your dossier is. And that might mean you get creative about how you present things. As you gain more experience, you'll also curate this document. You won't want to include necessarily every single guest lectureship you've had if you've also been teaching a number of courses. Maybe those will take the priority space in your dossier and other things will kind of drop off as you gain more experience. That's okay. What you are doing is you are creating this document for the purpose of what you're using it for. So if it's for an award application, the experiences that you highlight at the front, that you forefront in this document are going to be the ones that are most relevant to the award you're applying to. If you're using this for a job application, you might want to highlight the experiences that are really relevant and the most linked and aligned to that job you are applying for. So the contents globally of this document might stay the same, but how you organize them and how you emphasize them might change based on what you're using it for.
Carolyn?
Yeah, I see this question in the chat here. What's the relevance of the number of students in a course? Is it better to have fewer or more? So great question. I don't think it's better to have fewer or more, but I think it's important for us to know maybe the scope. If we see someone that's taught different, I'm going to back up here. Here we go. This is a good example. Here we can see in a snapshot that this person has taught courses from like an enrollment of 9, all the way up to an enrollment of over 500. That really shows like a breadth of teaching, small seminar courses, maybe at the graduate level, all the way down to probably a really large enrollment first year course. It shows kind of a bit of a difference in the scope of your teaching. You're probably going to have to adapt to different types of teaching styles or teaching approaches. If you have 500 students versus like 9 or 10, you might not, as like, if you're starting out, you might not have that opportunity. Some of us who are given TAships or guest lectures don't get to choose which courses we are assigned to. So we might not always have that scope, but including the number of students on average can be helpful to give a sense of what type of teaching. So are you only really teaching small seminar courses, or do you have experience across different things? I guess one thing to mention maybe that I can.
Sorry, Carolyn, like that's an amazing answer, and I really appreciate it. It's very, very helpful. But is this like, do we put if like the 560 could be across 5 sections, 100 each, or it could
Yeah.
be one section of 560. Is like that relevant at all? Or does it
Okay,
matter?
great. So great question. And I think the way I would answer this is you're telling this story to your reader. So you want to present it, you want to present the relevant information that you want to tell the reader. And so um, if part of my philosophy and part of my teaching approaches is how I engage really large first year courses, I'm going to make sure that I tell them that is one section of a first year course that I teach in a large lecture hall. And these are the approaches that I take to engage students while in a large first year lecture. If that was, you're right, if that was 5 sections of 100, that's also going to be relevant to how I talk about my approaches to teaching. Like I have to prepare and coordinate keeping my material consistent across 5 different sections. So I think that you asking that question means that there's a point in this dossier that could use some clarification, because that's a question that a reader might ask that might be relevant to a job or an award or whatever they're using this dossier for. So we're going to come back to this notion, I think, when we talk about the effectiveness section, because this is really about what is the story you're telling the reader. Don't let them interpret the information that you put in the dossier. You need to tell them how that information, how you want that information to be used and what the context was. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much. That's perfect. This is so
Great.
helpful.
Okay. So these examples all show kind of different ways that you might organize the information, but the information is roughly the same. It's just a different structure. The next piece is when we move into away from those responsibilities and those activities into what we call the evidence of your teaching effectiveness. So my question for you to take 1 minute here to think about is, when we talk about evidence of teaching effectiveness, how do you measure your impact? What are the first things you think of if you think of either formal or informal ways of measuring your teaching effectiveness? And you can pop something in the chat, or you can just think to yourself independently for a minute here. What is that first thing that comes to mind? Great. Thank you so much for the folks that are putting stuff in. And I'm kind of excited that I'm seeing a few similarities, but also a few really different ones in here too. So great. Some of those first initial gut reactions is student feedback and that formal assessment that we get from students. But I'm excited to see some other things in here, like the unsolicited feedback, student engagement and attendance. Like that's a great measure of your impact in teaching effectiveness. Good rapport, peer evaluation. Thank you. Oh my goodness. Okay, this is great because sometimes we ask this question and it's like everyone jumps to student evaluations of teaching. And what we're going to talk about is that a well-rounded dossier is well-rounded in that you're going to show lots of different experiences that you have as an educator. What are your contributions to the field? But also you want well-rounded section on how you have had an impact and what your effectiveness is. And the way to get that well-rounded impact and assessment is to have lots of ways that you have engaged with that evidence of your teaching effectiveness. So I think all of those things that you folks have put into the chat right now together make a really impactful section when we talk about evidence of teaching effectiveness. The first one that usually always comes up though is feedback from students, and largely because students are the population that gets surveyed by either us as we control and we put out surveys, or they are the ones that get surveyed by the more formal surveys from the institution. So we kind of jump to those end of term evaluations that are sent out that are now called at Queen's the QSETs, or if you've been here for a while, they used to be called the USATs. But there are other things that we can do too. So if you are a TA or a teaching fellow, you can do your own evaluations and write up some questions for students to get feedback on your teaching. And you can write some really carefully crafted questions to get them to really think about your approaches to teaching. Maybe you want to know about the content, but maybe you want to know things about your delivery and your choice of activities in the classroom. So you can create your own survey to start gathering some of that feedback. In the courses where we have formal end of term evaluations, we can also do some midterm check-ins, thinking about, what are we doing that you want to start, stop, and continue during the term to get some quick feedback from our students. As someone mentions, there's also kind of the solicited comments that come from those QSATs. There's also the unsolicited comments that we get from students. They send you an email with like, I really enjoyed this thing we did in class, or this activity or assessment. Put those in an email folder box or put them in a box on your desk, a binder on your desk. Like those are the things that you want to keep for, I think, days that you want that perk up, that you're doing a really good job in your teaching, but also that are important to include in your dossier. I also think it's important here to think about every time you receive feedback, whether it's from students or we'll talk about other sources of feedback, is to think about how you've implemented some of that feedback. What have you changed as a result of the feedback that you've received? When we look at putting the feedback into our dossier, it is common that you're going to want to pick all of the feedback that's really great and all of the things that you are doing well. But some of the most impactful dossiers that I've ever read also include the feedback where they got some really constructive feedback of things that they weren't perfect at, but they have written a really great narrative of how that has changed their teaching practice and the things that they've gone on to do later that have had a much greater impact on student learning because of that feedback and the change that they have made. So I would say don't shy away from thinking about the feedback that you get that might not seem so constructive in the moment, but that you can really reflect upon. That being said, student feedback is biased, and we know this. There is going to be feedback that you get that is not constructive and that is not helpful. And there is a point to say we need to separate the feedback that is constructive, that is helpful for us as educators, both positively and the constructive feedback that we can take and we can make really mindful and intentional changes in our teaching approaches. And then there are feedback that we know comes from biases based on the curriculum, the things we are intending to teach, who we are as educators, and our positionality. And a lot of that feedback is things that we don't take into that doesn't have a place and time because it doesn't impact the things that we can change to make a better student learning experience. So I think take all of your feedback with a bit of a grain of salt and know that there are some students that are going to give us really good positive or constructive feedback, and students that are going to give us stuff that's not so helpful that we put in a separate box to never look at again. And that's okay. So that being said, it is important to gather feedback from a number of sources, and student feedback is only one. And I was excited to see that some folks in the chat were also looking at peer feedback. If you are a TA or a TF, get a colleague, get another TA, get someone in to watch your teaching and give you some feedback. And even if that means it's just like a little excerpt or a paragraph that you can include in your teaching dossier, that's really helpful. Reach out to either a course instructor or a mentor in the department to also get feedback. They can be a really great source of feedback, someone either involved in the course that you are involved with or someone kind of adjacent. So maybe you are teaching a first or second year course and you bring in an instructor that's teaching later in the program to come in and watch your teaching and give you some feedback. Lastly, you can bring in a third party. So reach out to someone like us at the Center for Teaching and Learning and say, I'd like some feedback on my teaching. Oftentimes, we may not know anything about the content of what you're teaching. We may be from a different discipline, but that gives us an opportunity to come in and be able to really focus on your approaches to teaching, the strategies that you're using, and we can watch and see, what is happening in the classroom and provide you some feedback on the pedagogical choices that you are making outside of maybe the content choices that you are making. So think about in this section of your dossier, think about all of those opportunities where you can kind of blend different areas of feedback together to show all of that evidence of your teaching effectiveness. The other piece that I missed putting in here that I think some of you caught and put in the chat is some self-reflective pieces. We can often understand and learn more about our teaching by taking that self-reflection. Are students engaged? What am I doing differently to increase that engagement this year that I'm noticing a difference? Someone said student engagement to office hours. What might be sparking that? And that kind of narrative piece is often really impactful in your dossier as well. So thinking about self-reflection, student feedback, peer feedback, and also feedback from someone else like a mentor or the Center for Teaching and Learning. So how do you start putting it all together? So again, you're going to see everyone create this section differently in their dossier based on the level of experience they have. So how many years of teaching, how many different types of courses, and how the feedback is collected. Many folks that have formal student assessments of teaching will have kind of numerical data as well as student comments. And the numerical data can be somewhat tricky to present based on how you have been given the numerical data, but also kind of what you want to show with it. I think the most important thing to remember here is you need to provide the context to the reader. The context of what was collected, how it was collected, and what does it mean to you? So just throwing numbers on a page is going to be really hard for your reader to interpret because you are leaving them the space to interpret it the way they read it, as opposed to if you include the narrative pieces, you're now telling the story of what this data means in terms of who you are as a teacher. So that to me is a really important not to forget is you're putting the data in the section, but then you also need to tell the story that goes with that data. So here's an example of someone who has put in that numerical data from their end of term survey. They have the questions that were asked, the scale. So this was a scale of 1 to 5. And then each year that they taught the course, what their score was for that particular question. This might be a good layout if you want to compare across years. So we have the same question, the same course, and then they might have had an improvement across the years that they want to highlight. This is a really complex one that's very similar layout, but across multiple years and multiple courses. So again, here we have the questions that were asked, the course, the year, and in this case, the score that the instructor received compared to the score of the department average. This is when Queen's provides the summaries, it always has your score as the instructor, but it also compares it to the department average. Does that make sense for you to use in a dossier? That depends on your role. It depends on what you want to present as the story of your dossier. So in this case, this person has presented all of those scores. Again, here, what we can think about is student comments. So a lot of those end of term surveys will have student comments associated with them. Instead of just putting all of that data and student comments into this section, it is really important to think about curating what goes into the dossier. You cannot put everything in. You will run out of pages very quickly. And so when you think about curating what goes in, everything needs to tie back to supporting that teaching philosophy statement. So if you have values presented in that teaching philosophy statement, you need to be picking the data that supports those values that you are implementing in the classroom. So here in this example, this person has picked out student comments that supported intellectual rigor and learning community, which were two of the values that they presented in their opening philosophy statement. If there is more data that you want to present, that goes into an appendix that you can then refer to. You're selecting and curating what goes into the main dossier, and that appendix that we'll talk about at the end is where all of the rest of your stuff can go that you don't have room for, but that is relevant to what you want to present. All right. So I think I've already touched upon this, but presenting your teaching data effectively is a tricky task. And that's because too often we just put the information in there. Here's all of our data. But that really leaves room for the reader to do all of that interpretive work. And one of the best things that you can do is tell the story of what does that data mean? What did you learn from the data? How is it meaningful? How does it support your teaching values? Did you make a change in a course one year that is shown across that data? Maybe your scores dramatically improved when you implemented something because that's what's reflected in your teaching philosophy statement. Tell that story. And maybe this also impacts your professional development and some of those learning goals that you articulated early in your teaching philosophy. So if you had goals of what you wanted to do or what you wanted to learn, and maybe that came out in some of the data, talk about that and make that connection. So you are making this meaningful to the reader. Then there's all of the other sections that get built in. So I think what we've done is we've talked about 3 sections that are going to be kind of your big bulk of your dossier: the teaching philosophy statement, your teaching responsibilities or activities, and your evidence of teaching effectiveness. What then comes out is all of these other sections that are, I think, the supporting pieces of those 3. So that's innovation and curriculum design. What have you done in terms of building new things in the curriculum or pedagogical approaches? Educational leadership. Have you taken on any type of committee work or mentorship work in that space, whether that's at a particular university or college, or whether that's within your discipline? The scholarship of teaching and learning. So this dives into the research of teaching and learning within your discipline. So there are lots of opportunities for people to engage in research on teaching. So it might be research on an approach that you take in the classroom, or research on how students are learning particular elements of your discipline. But that is not necessarily your disciplinary research that you might do outside of teaching, but this is the research linked to teaching and learning. And then lastly, you'd want a section if you have any type of teaching award, whether that's as a TA, a TF, as a faculty member, any teaching award can go in that section. And then the last section that is always kind of talked about last, but I also think is really important, is your appendix. So although it's an appendix, although it's outside of the scope of the dossier proper, it's an important place to put things that you can refer to in your dossier that someone might go look at, like a course syllabus you've created or course materials that you've developed that are really innovative or that you want to showcase. You might have received letters from your colleagues and students. So if you had a peer observation and someone wrote you a letter, the full letter might not make it in the dossier, but it might go in the appendix, and then you pull out a quote to include in the dossier section. You might have samples of student work. So if you've done an assignment or an assessment that is unique and you want to be able to show this type of student work that comes out of that, you can just ask students to be able to anonymize their work and include it in your dossier. It might be where you put a publication of a SOTL project you've worked on, or even a description of the SOTL work that you're doing. More fleshed out data. So if you have a bunch of data and you're only including a subset, you can include all of your student data here in this section. And then a teaching sample. So historically, there used to be teaching samples recorded on DVDs that were stuck in the back of a dossier. I don't think anyone uses a DVD anymore. But if you had a digital, like if you had a lecture that was recorded on YouTube, or a sample of your teaching on your own website that you wanted to include, that could also be put into an appendix. So to bring everything together, what makes a strong dossier? I think that there are a lot of ways that you can create a strong dossier, and all of the strong and impactful dossiers I've read look different. They are not all cookie cutter, and I say it's about creating something that really speaks to who you are. However, many of the strong dossiers have some components that I think are common among all of them. And that's that they focus on strengths, your goals, but also the areas for improvement that you've had, and the growth trajectory. I think many of them convey a mindset of continuous learning and growth. A lot of the strong dossiers are really reflective. They show that you have done the work to reflect on your teaching, improve, and are really intentional about the choices you are making for student learning. They're clear, and then you're presented with the context for the documents included. So sometimes there is an appendix of 30 pages. And if we don't know why that stuff has been included, it doesn't add a lot to the person that's reading the dossier. So making sure that anything you have put in, there is really good linkage and alignment of why that has been included in your dossier. And lastly, make it personalized. It is great to be able to read a dossier and get a sense and imagine what your classroom would be like if I was to step into your classroom. So thinking about making it personal, making it something that is unique to your approach to teaching and who you are. So there's a question in the chat around international teaching experiences. And I'm going to say that they are certainly not of less value at all. I think you need to be including every teaching experience that you have in your dossier, because regardless of the experience of where you were teaching globally, or whether it was in a college system, whether it was in a university system, that is all teaching experience. And chances are all of those experiences have taught you something and brought you to where you are today. So all of those experiences are valuable. I think all of them should be included. Some of that might also include the narrative of how that experience contributed to parts of your teaching philosophy or parts of the approaches that you take today. what I would maybe suggest, I'm reading the comment here, what I would maybe suggest is as you are including those different experiences in your teaching dossier, in your section on teaching responsibilities, make sure you include the context. So we talked about context of, what type of course, maybe roughly how many students. It would be important to include if it was like a course that was like a fieldwork course, or if it was a course with lab work or with like more seminar based. But I think having a bit of the context associated with that is important. The other thing that I would mention is that some institutions and some different educational systems across the world use different terminology in terms of your title as a teacher. So at Queen's, we use like teaching assistant, teaching fellow, adjunct, faculty. But that's not the case in a lot of other places. So if there's a different term that you were hired in for a teacher, maybe it's also defining what that term means. Were you a graduate student educator? Were you a post-grad educator? What was your role? So I think that's important. So I hope that answers your question. And as soon as we're done here, we'll open it up for some more questions if you want some extra clarification. The other question I'm seeing that comes into the chat is, I've had opportunities to develop pedagogically based curriculum for non-teaching settings. That's teaching experience. That's still curriculum development. And I think that certainly goes in a dossier. Where the idea of your dossier being a curated document comes into play is, I think when you are crafting your dossier for the first time, all of your teaching experiences goes into that, regardless if that's a traditional teaching setting or not. And then as you continue to gain more experiences, that's when you're going to decide which experiences are most relevant for the use of your dossier in that moment. So those kind of like alt academic types of curriculum development experiences might be useful now in your dossier, but might not be useful in the future. And then you would choose to take them out. And then I see one more question in the chat that I will respond to now, and then we'll open it up into a more broad Q&A. And that's, how would you recommend presenting your dossier, like a virtual platform? And this is a great question. I started my dossier in a time when everything was just a paper, like Word document. I had a DVD of my teaching, which tells you when I started teaching. But I think that, again, this is going to be unique to how you feel you are best presented. Most often when they are asking you for a dossier for a job application, they might ask you for a specific format. So that might dictate how you present something. But it doesn't mean if you have an e-portfolio version or a website version of your dossier that you can't also link to that. So I think that's a very personal decision of how you feel your data, like the scope of who you are as an educator is presented best. But it's always helpful, I think, to have kind of a document version in like a Word document, or something that you can easily every year kind of pick at and go change. That would be something that you could send out for, a committee to review. But I know lots of folks that are also building digital versions that they link to as well. All right, so I'm going to come back. I see more questions coming in the chat. I will come back to them. I know there's a few folks that I have to leave. So I did want to just finish off by saying that there are tons of resources to start your dossier, both at Queen's and elsewhere. There are some great websites. I highly suggest finding some sample dossiers to read, and you'll figure out what you like and what you don't, what speaks to you. There's also some really great videos out there that have different opinions on, what to emphasize in your dossier. So I encourage you to kind of check those out. And then book a consultation with us. I think a really valuable piece is, once you've started drafting something and you have kind of a rough draft, that's a great point to book a consultation and get some feedback from a colleague or from us at the Center for Teaching and Learning. I will be sharing the slides. They will go out. We can send them out by email after the fact. And that will give you access to also some of the resources that I've quoted today, that you can also go take a look at, if that's helpful. So what I will do is I will stop sharing and we can open this up for some discussion, so that I can maybe see folks, and we'll ask that the recording be stopped at this point.